Greetings YouTube! In this video we'll be making this reversible skirt. Let's get started! For this project I'll be using this black cotton fabric, and for my second fabric I will be recycling this old skirt, also cotton. For this skirt we need to take 4 basic measurements: our waist, the widest part around our hips, the vertical measurement between our waist and the widest part of our hips, and we also want to measure the length we want our skirt. I've gone a little out of frame, but I've measured to around 2 or 3 inches above my knee. I have my fabric laid out lengthwise, folded in half. Now our first measurement is going to be the length of our skirt. I measured mine at 17 inches. To add plenty of room for seams and hems, I'm going to add 1.5 inches to that measurement. So I'm going to measure 18.5 inches from the top of my fabric. And I'm going to do that all the way across. Now we're going to take our next measurement, which will be our waist to hip measurement. Mine is 6 inches. So again, working across, measure 6 inches from the top of our fabric. And we draw a line across. And this gives us our hip line. So at the top we have the waist, the hips, and the bottom of the skirt. Now we're going to work over here on the fold of the fabric. This is going to be our back. And our next measurement we take is going to be our waist measurement. My waist measurement is 27 inches. Now we want to divide that by 4. So I divide 27 by 4, that's 6.75 inches. So I mark that on my fabric. Now to this measurement I add another inch for the dart and another ½ inch for the seam allowance. Next we take our hip measurement. Mine is 34 inches, and again we divide that by 4. So 34 divided by 4 is 8.5. I find the 8.5. And to that I'm going to add another ½ inch for ease of movement and another ½ inch for the seam allowance. So altogether that's 9.5 inches. And I make that same measurement on the bottom of the skirt. I'll just add my hip measurement of 8.5 inches. But this time I'm not going to add any extra, apart from ½ inch for the seam allowance, because I want my skirt to taper back in. So now we're going to join the outer marks from the hip and the bottom of the skirt. And we're also going to join the outer measurement between the waist and the hip, but we're going to draw a slight curve. Next we're going to mark the halfway point between the 2 edges of the skirt. So from the centre to the edge here I have 8.5 inches. I'm going to find the centre point, which is 4¼ inches, and I'm going to make a mark. I'm also going to mark along the hip line 4¼ inches from the fold of the fabric. And I join those 2 marks together. And where we made our mark on the waist, we mark 1/2 inch on either side, and that will be the inch for our dart. Along the line we drew, we mark 1 inch up from the hip line, and on that new mark we connect it to either side of the dart where we made those 2 marks. And that's the back side of our skirt done. Now we're going to work on the front. So we take that waist measurement again, divided by 4. For me, that's 6.75. And to that, we add 1 inch for the dart and 1/2 inch for the seam allowance. And now for the front, we're going to add an extra measurement for the button. So I measure the button I'm going to be using. It's just over 1/2 inch. I want to give a little bit of room either side. So I would give that button about 1 inch. And we're going to fold over that part of the fabric, so we want to double that. So I'm going to add 2 inches to that measurement. Now we take our hip measurement divided by 4. Mine was 8.5. We add 1 inch for ease of movement plus seam allowance. And then we add that 2 inches for the button. Now I'm going to take the same measurement for the bottom of the skirt, which was my hip measurement divided by 4. It was 8.5 plus 1/2 inch for the seam allowance. And again, we're going to add those 2 inches for the buttons. Again, we join the outer measurement from the bottom of the skirt to the hip. And from the hip to the waist, again, making a curve. Now for the darts on the front. Again, we find the centre measurement. In this case, it's 5¼ inches. And I measure 5¼ inches from the edge along the hip line. And I join those 2 markings together. On either side of the marking at the waist measurement, we mark 1/2 inch. We measure 1 inch up from the hip. And we join that marking to the 2 markings on either side of that line. And that's our skirt all marked out, and we're ready to cut. Now we want to mark our darts on the other side. So we take some pins and we push 2 through at the top of the darts and 1 at the bottom. And we turn our fabric over and see where the pins are poking through. We take 3 more pins and poke them through the other side, just where the other pins are coming through. And we can pull our 2 halves of the fabric apart. Leaving our new pins in place. We can then use our pins as a guide to mark our new dart. And I do the same with the front. Now I'm going to trace my cutout pieces onto my second fabric. Now because this fabric has a pattern, I've had to lay out my pieces to fit according to that pattern, so that it will be even across the skirt. Because of this, I'm going to have to add an extra centimetre to the centre back so that I can sew a seam. If you're using a non-pattern fabric, you would just place this along the fold and cut accordingly. So I'm going to trace out these pieces and cut. And now I'm going to transfer the darts onto my second fabric. to go around and overlock all the edges of each of my pieces. If you don't have a serger or an overlocking foot, you can just make a zigzag stitch as close to the edge as possible. I fold along the darts, making sure the two top edges line up, and I fold it along to the point, and I use a couple of pins to hold it in place. I pin along the chalk line and make sure the pins measure up with the chalk line on the other side. I do this with all the darts, and then I sew them from top to bottom. I then sew the edges together, and I do the same with both fabrics. Next I press the darts and the seams. I then top stitch the seams on both skirts. Now I lay the skirts down and place them right sides together, and I match up the seams and darts, pinning them together. And I pin all the way around the edge. Now I make a few marks on either side of the skirt. I mark 1 inch from the top, and I mark 1 inch all the way down. I sew along the first line, starting 1 inch from the top, and I'm going to sew 1/2 inch along the bottom and then along the line up to 1 inch from the top. Now I've sewn along the side seams and the bottom of the skirt. I can now turn the skirt right side out, making sure I push through the corners. Now I'm going to press the hem and side seams. I turn over the top of the skirt by 1/2 inch and press. I do this for both sides. And with my top seams both pressed inwards, I again match up all the seams and the darts and pin the two skirts together. And keeping as close to the edge as possible, I top stitch along the upper edges and top of the skirt. Now I'm going to go around and top stitch along the sides and bottom of the skirt, and normally we would have our thread matching our fabric, and if you're using two fabrics you would have your bobbin thread matching whichever colour you're sewing on the bottom and your top thread matching the top. But I want the black side of my skirt to have decorative top stitching in a contrasting colour, so I'm using purple for both bobbin and main thread. Now I'm going to go around and top stitch along the sides and bottom of the skirt, as well as 1/2 inch down from the top. And finally I top stitch 1 inch in from the front sides. I'm using 8 buttons and I've laid them out where I want them. And now I'm going to mark where the buttons sit, leaving a space of 1 inch between them. And this is where I'm going to sew my buttonholes. And when I've made all my holes, I line up the edges and I make a mark through each of the buttonholes. And these mark where we're going to place our buttons. I'll be using these flat buttons so they don't poke me when they're on the inside. I take my first button and put it in place, and I sew through from the back to the front. I move across diagonally and sew from front to back. And this is where we're going to add the button on the other side. Make sure it's sitting in place. And we sew back diagonally from the back to the front, coming back through that hole. I sew back through both buttons a few more times, keeping the tension of the thread relatively loose. And then I sew through the second button, and then sew diagonally through the other way, going through both buttons. And when we've sewn through a few times, we sew through the top button and under the bottom button. Wrapping our thread around a few times, making half hitch knots. Sew back through, coming back under the top button. Again, wrapping our thread and making half hitch knots. On the final wrap we make a surgeon's knot, passing our needle through the loop twice. We then sew up through the fabric, pulling the needle through and cutting off the yarn. I sew on my double-sided buttons all the way down. Make sure to keep the tension loose. If you sew your buttons together too tightly, you won't be able to get it through the buttonhole. And our skirt is done. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.